Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's The Inclusion Imperative, the Business Case for a More Inclusive Culture webinar brought to you by your Vanderbilt Alumni Association. I'm Drew Webb, Assistant Director of Student Alumni Engagement with the Alumni Association, and I'm so glad you could join us today from wherever you are. Today's webinar will be wrapped up within an hour, lasting around 45 minutes with time at the end for questions. Please type questions as you have them into the question box, and we will make sure that these are addressed before our time is up today. We're recording the presentation and we'll share a link with you via email later this week. I'm super excited to introduce you to our presenter today. Liji Thomas is the founder and CEO of Inclusion Evangelist. Liji has the distinct perspective of having worked on building an award-winning inclusion strategy for a Fortune 500, as well as having worked on the largest race discrimination class action settlement in history, giving her the experience and insight to see both the opportunity and risk around inclusion for corporate America. Liji was a former Senior Manager of Diversity and Inclusion for Southwest Airlines. Her background includes experience in compliance, audit, risk management, and diversity and inclusion. She holds an MBA in finance as well as master's degrees in accounting and information technology management and consulting, along with CPA, CIA, CRMA, and SHRM designations. She is a graduate of Vanderbilt University and the University of Texas at Dallas, and she's also a graduate of the Leadership Dallas class of 2017. Liji is married with 2 children and devotes her time to various civic and charitable causes. Liji, thank you so much for being with us today to present on this important topic.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Drew, and welcome to all of my fellow Commodores who are listening. Thank you for dialing in for what I believe is one of the most important conversations we can have today. I have a lot of material that I want to get through. So I am going to, in the span of the next 45 minutes together, I really want to present the business case for a more inclusive culture. I've entitled this presentation, The Power of Inclusion, because at the end of our 45 minutes together, I hope you will be convicted around the notion of how powerful a more inclusive culture is. So before, anytime I hear people speak, I just like to know who's talking to me. So Drew, thank you for that great introduction. I just want to say a word about my own personal journey. As Drew alluded to, 18 years ago, I was a young paralegal and worked on a class action lawsuit where we really saw the risk side of inclusion efforts or lack thereof. And then had a whole career in audit, risk management, compliance. Drew went through some of my nerdy past. And then about 7 years ago was shoulder tapped to build diversity and inclusion for Southwest Airlines, one of the most well-known and well-loved brands. And I really saw the power of, I used to think the hard stuff is things like ticking and tying financial statements from my audit days. I now believe the hard stuff is really the soft stuff, the things like teamwork and culture and inclusion. But they're really important because they undergird everything about how a team performs. And we'll get into this a little later, but they can really make or break brands and companies, especially in this day and age. So with that primer, let's get straight into the material. Again, I'm going to go really fast, but I will do my best to honor 15 minutes at the end, and we'll really look forward to your questions. Before we really learn about the business case for inclusion, I think this is a topic that we really need to unlearn about. So before we talk about the new dialogue around inclusion, I want to say something about the old monologue and how this conversation has been in the past. So in the past, this used to be an us versus them, black versus white, male versus female. Used to be a shame and blame game, right? Some people were more enlightened around how to be inclusive. Some people weren't. Particularly white straight men got left out of the conversation. The old monologue was around, again, certain people having all the insight. We focused a lot on similarities, and we focused on the golden rule, which is treat others as you would have others treat you. The The new dialogue around inclusion is very much around the thought that we are all agents of change. We're all in this together. The white straight male is an important part of the diversity dialogue. We are all collectively smarter than any one individual. Focusing on the power, really recognizing and leveraging the power of difference. And if we used to talk about the golden rule before today, particularly in inclusion, we talk about the platinum rule, which is treat others as they would want to be treated. And obviously a necessary prerequisite to that is to really get to know who people uniquely are. Okay, with that reframing, let's jump right into the business case. The first part of the business case is all around employee engagement. We know as you create environments where employees or individuals can bring their whole selves to work, employees just thrive. And there's so much, with anything I present today, there is so much research behind this stuff. And I'm happy, if anyone wants to follow up with me, I'm happy to send you links to research or case studies. But we know when employees show up in an environment where they're seen and when they are valued for who they are, it really has a way of leveraging particularly the discretionary engagement and energy that they bring to their jobs. We also know that a diverse workforce attracts top talent. So this is the second part of the business case, is all about talent management. As we all know, there's a global war for talent, and in today's day and age, there are no barriers to that talent. And a diverse workforce where there's diversity at every level of an organization tends to attract the best talent. One of the things I used to hear all the time when I had a full role in diversity inclusion for corporate America was, especially from underrepresented talent, hey, Liji, we cannot be what we cannot see. And that's absolutely true. So we know when people see people that reflect who they are, they know that there are no barriers to talent in their organization. The next part of the business case is all around better business outcomes. There's a great case study from Harvard Business Review called Diversity as Strategy. And this really chronicles IBM's diversity strategy and how they leveraged internal diversity to really increase market share. And we'll talk a little bit more about this. And yet another corporate example of leveraging diversity for better business outcomes. Typically, companies for new product development, companies will go to their R&D departments. Well, Frito-Lay decided to do something different. They wanted to come up with a new product offering to leverage the rapidly growing Hispanic population in the US. So they did something somewhat non-traditional. Instead of going to R&D, they went to their Hispanic employee network, which is called Adelante. And Frito-Lay went to their Hispanic employees and they said, listen, we want to come up with a new product offering that really speaks to the Hispanic population. Tell us about packaging, tell us about marketing to this demographic, tell us about, how can we really use the insight that our Hispanic employees bring to introduce a new product offering. Long story short, they came up with the guacamole brand of Doritos, which generated more than $100 million in its first year, $100 million in sales in its first year alone. Again, another example, both IBM as well as Frito-Lay, of companies that have really leveraged difference and employee diversity to actually translate into revenue and better business outcomes. And we'll see some other examples of that later on in the presentation. For now, I'd like to, you guys are likely a little sick of hearing me talk, so let's cut to a video that I think is a powerful video where we'll watch some of what Tom Peters, who's a famous management guru, has to say about diversity, and just a caveat to this video. In this video, Tom Peters talks about diversity with a lowercase d. It's really about diversity of thought, right? And it's sometimes we get caught up in, kind of just external diversity. But Tom Peters is really talking about diversity of thought. So let's take a look at what Tom Peters has to say about diversity. So Drew, if we can cue up that Tom Peters video.
Yeah, and just a note to everyone who's joining us, if anyone dialed in on their phone, the audio for this video won't play through your phone, so just make sure to turn up the volume on your computer so you can hear the video.
Great. Thanks so much, Drew. I always have some great questions whenever I show that video, so I'll look forward to hearing y'all's questions if there are any on that video. But great things that Tom Peters has to, again, reinforcing the point about the power of diversity of thought. Next part of the business case is all about innovation. We know that, again, to what Tom Peters just said, as you bring different people who think differently together, you just come up with different ways of thinking that are absolutely critical to driving innovation. Innovation is such a hot topic for companies today, so I do want to delve a little bit into this. And in doing so, I just want to clarify, first of all, what we are really talking about when we talk about diversity. So what I'll dive into is some research that comes out of the Center for Talent Innovation. And let's start first here with defining diversity as really two-dimensional. So we talk about inherent diversity, and a good way to think about inherent diversity is the types of ways, unique differences you have of which you have no control. So these are things like your age, your gender, any type of disability, etc. And then we talk about acquired diversity. And acquired diversity is all of the things that you have done or acquired through the span of your life that contributes to the way you think. So any sort of global experience, military experience, language proficiency, etc. And what the Center for Talent Innovation did is they did a lot of research around really looking at how do companies that leverage two-dimensional diversity, is there any benefit to these companies? And what they found is employees in companies with two-dimensional diversity are 75% more likely to have a marketable idea implemented. And even more powerfully, and this is a tribute to diverse leadership, or leadership that can really leverage the diversity on a team. Employees in publicly traded organizations with two-dimensional diversity are 70% more likely to see their organization capture a new market, and 45% more likely to see their organization improve market share more than employees in publicly traded organizations without two-dimensional diversity. So some really powerful statistics around the value of both inherent as well as acquired diversity. This research was the subject of a Harvard Business Review article called How Diversity Can Drive Innovation. There's also another article called How Diversity Makes Us Smarter. Some of the best research around this stuff is certainly coming out of Harvard. Again, a lot of research behind this stuff. Just trying to touch on the key parts of the business case in the 45 minutes we have together. So the next part of the business case is all around mirroring the marketplace. So the slide you're looking at now is the projected growth of the US population from 2010 to 2050 based on the last US Census. And what you'll see is obviously what Frito-Lay saw, which is number one, the huge growth in the Hispanic population in this country, followed by the growth in the Asian population as well as the Black population. And you'll see that white non-Hispanic growth is the smallest. And again, these are shifts that you are already seeing happening in this country. There's some cities now, for example, Houston is an example of a city that is now known to a lot of demographers, a lot of folks that do inclusion work, as a majority minority city, which means that the demographics in a city like Houston have so shifted that the traditionally minority populations have now surpassed the white non-Hispanic population. Next part, so at this point you all are probably thinking, okay, Liji, we get the connection to talent management, innovation, but can you, is there really an effect on stock performance? So I'm glad you asked. The next slide looks at, so the next slide is tracking the stock performance of companies in Diversity Inc.'s top 50. This is just a measure of the companies that are most progressive in diversity and inclusion efforts against both the S&P 500 as well as the Dow Jones, on both a total return as well as a total annualized return basis. And so for my friends who are not as nerdy as I am or into stock performance, basically the headline on this is what it appears to show is that companies that are more progressive in diversity and inclusion efforts outperform companies that are not on both the total return as well as a total annualized return basis. And I want to be sure to say, caveat here is, I'm not saying that diversity and inclusion is a panacea for poor stock performance. This is not a direct causal relationship, but there appears to be some connection. Now that connection could be because of the data we've already seen. The connection between inclusion and innovation, or the connection between inclusion and employee engagement. But nonetheless, another data point, if you will, in support of companies outperforming when they're more intentional about diversity at their company. So if you like the financial data, let me present one more piece of the business case all around the financials. And this is actually coming from McKinsey, and McKinsey has actually quantified this. They call this the diversity dividend. Here's their starting point is, what's the likelihood that companies in the top quartile for diversity financially outperform companies that are in the bottom quartile? And what they found is companies that are more gender diverse outperform by 15% companies that are not, and companies that are focused on ethnic diversity in addition to gender diversity see an uptick of 35% in financial performance. Again, a lot of research, and you know, it's interesting to note this is not coming from some diversity consulting firm. This is actually coming from McKinsey. And so really powerful data points around the business case for companies that leverage, again, both 2D diversity, both acquired as well as inherent. Okay, so from the business case too, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about all of the things going on in our world today around diversity. So whether it's Time Magazine naming the silence breakers, the whole genesis of the hashtag #MeToo movement, what's happened at Uber, Google, these stories around diversity, certainly in our culture and in our media, it's hard to escape this conversation. And what it shows is that engagement in issues of diversity and inclusion is no longer optional. Okay, so given a really strong business case, I should say a word about this. I talk so much about the business case. I'd be remiss too if I didn't say there is a lot of research too on just the personal toll that. So there's actual research that exclusion or being in environments or in teams where people are excluded actually registers as physical pain for people. And there's studies that have been done on this as well. But again, the title of this is about the business case, but I have to mention a word about the personal effects of inclusion as well on people in our companies and in our institutions. Okay, so that's a little bit about the business case. So given such a strong business case around inclusion, what is the actual state of inclusion in corporate America, at least by the aspects of diversity that we can measure? And by all accounts, the current state of inclusion in corporate America is abysmal at best. What you're looking at is graphs that show, for example, what the Fortune 500 CEOs look like by race and ethnicity, as well as by gender, Fortune 500 CEOs. And as you can tell, we have a lot of work to do when it comes to really breaking the glass ceiling, if you will. And this is across corporate America. And there are efforts now. There's something actually called the CEO Summit on Inclusion, where it's 150 of the CEOs of the largest companies in the country have come together to really figure out why is there such of a disconnect between the conversation around inclusion in corporate America and the lack of outcomes. So again, strong business case, yet very little has changed in corporate America. So you have to ask why. And part of the why around it is, again, another hot topic is all around unconscious bias. Unconscious bias or implicit bias is all about the attitudes and stereotypes, largely in our subconscious, which affect our opinions, our beliefs about other people, and really filter into everything that we do. And the real takeaway here is that unconscious bias unchecked in our organizations really leads to unintentional incompetence. Unconscious bias is a whole body of work, and the institution that does the best research around this is actually Harvard. There's actually a test you can take. It's called the Implicit Association Test. You see a link for it on the slide that's up now. That will actually reveal to you some of your biases. So we all like to think that we're not biased. But the reality is, if you're human, you're biased. We all have biases. And unless you check yourself on your biases, you can't help but let them filter into the way you hire, the way you view people. And it's largely unconscious. I was talking to a leader at Southwest Airlines, and he's this great example of the voice. So for anyone that's listening, and if you've ever seen the show The Voice, you listen to someone singing and the chair turns around, and sometimes you are surprised by the person who that voice is coming from, because we all have preconceived notions about what people can do, or just by looking at people, our biases just creep into how we judge people, and we all do this. But for purposes of our conversation today, and really focused on corporate America, it's important to note that these unconscious biases show up at work in a number of ways. In how we recruit people, we make hiring decisions, we mentor who we mentor or sponsor, how we make job assignments, even listening to people's ideas and suggestions in a meeting. how we give performance feedback, how we treat customers. So if you look at the list of things there are a list of major things that go on, particularly in the employee experience of most companies. So just to note about, for example, gender bias. Again, another, I love referring to HBR articles only because Harvard Business Review is probably the preeminent institution and magazine that's covering a lot of the research around this work. So here's what we know from a recent article. We know that what the research says is that men are hired and promoted on potential, and women are hired and promoted on past experience. So again, how this creeps into our institutions, we like to think of the way we promote and hire as based strictly on merit and an idea of meritocracy. But what the research shows is there's actually different standards that we use to, and this is just a example in the case of gender diversity. There's also, I mean, we can look at, there's a clear bias for extraversion, particularly in American business. And so when you look at...
Liji, are you there?
Yes. Can you hear me? Yes. Can you hear me, Drew?
Hang on just a minute. It looks like we've lost Liji's audio. We'll see if she hops back on.
Hey, Drew, can you hear me? Hey, Drew? Drew, I'm here. Can you hear me? Hello? Hey, Drew, can you hear me? Hello? Hello? Drew, can you hear me? Okay, I think we're having technical difficulties. I'm going to keep going. Drew, I'm not sure if you can hear me, but I have some fabulous folks who are listening in who are texting me saying you can hear. So I'm going to keep going in the interest of time. Okay, so we talked about extrovert bias in business. So let me talk a little bit. I always like to provide hope, despite what the current state of inclusion is in corporate America, or lack thereof, if you will. So what's the solution here? Solution here is, and this is really what I focus a lot of my time and energy doing, is really partnering with companies and organizations to mitigate the effects of unconscious bias in their entire employee life cycle, from hiring to recruitment, from potential mentorship programs. So word about mentorship programs, there's also this research back to gender diversity. What the research says is that women are over-mentored and under-sponsored. Sponsorship really changes the rules of the game in corporate America. So I really help companies look at their entire employee life cycle and mitigate the effects of unconscious bias, and really help align talent management, inclusion efforts, employee engagement, to really build corporate environments, organizational environments where there are no barriers to talent. And when you do that, everybody wins, including straight white men who typically have been left out of this conversation. Let me present to you part of the solution. A great example to look at is actually the way orchestras have changed the way they hire musicians. So as late as 1970, the top 5 orchestras in the US had fewer than 5% women. And by 1997, they were up to 30% women. So how did they do this? And they made a simple fix. They started having blind auditions where you could not see the person who was auditioning. So this is back to the voice, back to, again, we like to think that we don't judge people by how they look. We judge them just on performance. But again, unless all the orchestra did was just hold blind auditions, and they were able to increase gender diversity in orchestras. So actually, what their research showed was that conducting blind auditions in a preliminary round of auditions for the orchestra, just that one change alone made it 50% more likely that a female will advance to the final rounds of auditions. So again, one small example of the power of mitigating the effects of unconscious bias and that's just hiring. So you can imagine how powerful it is when you partner your inclusion efforts with your talent management and across the HR lifecycle in an organization. If it can make that create that change in outcomes just in hiring, what it can do. Again, there's a lot of examples that I could use to highlight this, and a lot of examples certainly from the companies that I work with, but I thought it was just interesting to use something like the orchestra to show that these principles really transcend whether it's corporate America, the orchestra, anywhere where you're really looking for the best talent. In closing, I hope that in the limited amount of time that we have together, I've really impressed upon my fellow Commodores that are listening in about really how critical the need for inclusive leadership is in our organization. A lot of our organizations, our biggest challenge is around creating growth. In order to create growth, you have to differentiate. It's a business imperative for so many companies today. In order to differentiate, innovation is such a key driver. There is so much research. I've only skimmed the surface of it in our time together around the link between inclusion and innovation. And really to activate that diversity, you really need inclusive leadership. So the takeaway of this slide is that it's really inclusive leadership that will drive organizational growth in the 21st century. And several of you listening in are decision makers in your organizations. I think that there are things we can do both personally and professionally to ensure that we create environments that are ever more inclusive. And I think the only time you fail is when you think that you have arrived and that there's no more work to be done. Because my experience has shown that this is an ongoing journey, especially as our workforces and our institutions face ever increasing challenges around innovation and become more diverse. I didn't touch on the whole shift that is happening around the incredible growth of millennials in the workplace. And we can do a whole webinar around any one of these issues. But you know, they say webinars. I'm sorry. Millennials are really, for them, and they will be very soon, the largest age demographic in the workplace. And they, for millennials, they're really quick to spot the disconnect between what organizations say they're about and what they really do in practice. So this is becoming, if it isn't already, the imperative around inclusion is becoming that much, the sense of urgency around creating environments of inclusion is that much more urgent. In closing, I want to challenge all of us to be change agents, both personally and professionally in our organizations. I want to challenge us to really be radically inclusive, insatiably curious, and constructively discontent. in the way we approach. And a lot of times, I will tell you in my experience, it just takes one person asking the incredibly powerful question of why. Why is it that we don't have more women? If you believe talent comes in every shape, size, color, sexual orientation, why is it as you get to the top of every institution, we lose diversity? It's increasingly one demographic. And that should be a question for people that are not, you don't have to be passionate about inclusion. You have to be passionate about creating the best team. And ensuring that there are no barriers to talent in your organization. I want to thank you all for your time together. I believe this is work that deeply best serves people as well as organizations, and is critical and demands our engagement, and especially for us as professionals who are working in institutions that are poised to outperform the global competition in the global marketplace of the 21st century. I want to queue up one final video. It's a great video. This is Accenture's Inclusion Starts With I campaign. It's a very personal call to action, and I hope it will wrap up and really present a little bit of a more personal flavor around how we can all be change agents. So Drew, if I haven't lost you, if you can still hear me, if you can cue up that last video, and I will look forward to hearing your questions after we view this video.
I can still hear you. We just lost your audio for a minute or two, but we're back, and so I will play the video.
Okay, thank you, Drew. Great, and hope you all enjoyed that video. With that, thank you all so much for your time, and I will punt back to you, Drew, if you'd like to facilitate our Q&A.
Great, thank you so much, Liji. We do have several questions that came in, so we'll go ahead and get started. The first one says, inclusion sounds good, but should we ignore the possibility that sometimes inclusion of disparate groups may breed contempt and distrust, whereas a homogeneous group would be more aligned personally so that they can focus on similar goals professionally?
Yeah, so I really appreciate the question. So you're absolutely right in that. So back to what we talked about, innovation, and there's a constructive disruption that happens when you bring different groups of people together. So I like this thought that we're comforted by our by our similarity, but we only ever learn from diversity of thought. So the caller is right that if you want zero disruption, you want people who all think the same, then absolutely surround yourself by people who all went to the same school, all have the same occupation, or all the same race, gender. But this absolutely does not bode well in terms of better business outcomes, innovation, better business decisions. And so that's what the entire presentation has shown. Is there a part of that that is disruptive? Are you going to get, but this is where different people and learning to interact with people who are different makes us better. I appreciate where the question is coming from. And I will say with full transparency to this conversation, you will have less disruption if you surround yourself with, and as human beings, we are hardwired to surround ourselves with people who are exactly like us. But this, you almost conspire in your own self, in your own diminishment when you do that, because you never, I mean, there's so much has been said about in the wake of the last election, how polarized we are as a country and how we live in echo chambers of our own thinking. Nobody wins when that happens. And so what's going on in the country happens in our institutions where we never learn from each other. And surround yourself if you want to by people who are exactly like yourself, but you will do it at the detriment of yourself as well as your organization. I hope I've answered that question accurately, but yes, there is a constructive disruption that comes with diversity, but it is absolutely enlightened self-interest to invite that in and to effectively leverage that diversity for benefit.
Okay, great. Here's another question that just came in. As someone with a non-HR background who wants to get a certification in diversity and inclusion, what would you recommend?
I love the question. There are HR diversity certifications out there. To be honest with you, this is an area of study that organizations are and institutions of higher learning are creating a curriculum around. I believe Georgetown may be one of the only universities that has, I want to say they have either a certificate program or a master's program. I'm happy to, whoever asked this question, feel free to send me an email. I'm happy to send you links to the institutions that I know of that have programs. And I think it's either the National Diversity Council or the Texas Diversity Council also has a certification. But to be very honest with you, there, in terms of establishing the body of knowledge for inclusion work, this is something that universities are now really trying to figure out. And when I know I'm in Dallas, Texas, so I know SMU Business School is actually one that's looking to develop an inclusive leadership curriculum. But whoever asked this question, if you'll send me an email, and those are just a couple of them that I can think of off the top of my head, but I'm happy to send you an email with more resources.
Great. Here's another question, comment that came in. This person said, I really appreciate this presentation and the many supporting research, testimonial, and proof points. I was, however, struck by the fact that the term values was never offered as part of the dialogue. Liji, can you offer some input on whether it is really shared values, where values have embedded understanding of accepted diversity, is really the key to institutions going farther? Not more diversity unto itself is one view, is what this person said.
Okay, so if I understood the question correctly, I'm going to answer the question as I understood it, but Drew, feel free to correct me if your understanding of the question was different. So many of our institutions, yes, there is a stated value around inclusion, no barriers to talent, etc. There is this disconnect, though, between what are stated values in an organization. And again, unless an organization is mitigating the effects of unconscious bias, what we know is that you almost can't help. The first 50 years of diversity inclusion work was trying to get people to free themselves, if you will, of bias. But what we now know is you can't actually do that. What you have to do is take a systems point of view and actually mitigate the effects of bias wherever it shows up at work. But there, in terms of values, I mean, institutional equity, fairness, these are not only corporate values, these are American values, a sense of meritocracy, a sense of fairness, a sense of equal opportunity are American values in any great company or institution. These are valued. So if I understood the question correctly, I mean, absolutely, you could talk about this from a values point of view. But here's my thing is, if we just focused on this is the right thing to do, which it is absolutely the right thing to do, both for our people as well as our institutions, we would have gotten a lot further already. So I humbly submit to whoever asked the question, what you need to do is to align a powerful value proposition, which absolutely there's a case to be made around equal opportunity, institutional equity, and fairness for people. That value coupled with a really strong business case, and you know, it is you know, it's almost a no-brainer that companies take issues of diversity and inclusion seriously in their organizations. Drew, have I understood that question correctly, or did you understand it?
I think you did very well. Thank you. And I just have one more question. I wonder if you could share a few strategies, best practices for inclusion and diversity. I know you mentioned some about hiring, but I wondered if you had any other thoughts on some strategies that people could start implementing in their companies today.
Absolutely. You know, I mentioned briefly around mentorship and sponsorship. So a lot of companies, certainly some of them that I work with, have great mentorship programs. Mentorship programs are great, but so let me step back here and clarify the difference between mentorship and sponsorship. So mentorship is somebody that you talk to about your career. Sponsorship is a person who talks about you in those closed door conversations when decisions are made about who gets the next hot job or decisions about your career. So one of the best practices that companies can do is really look at mentorship, sponsorship programs for their high potential talent. And again, to ensure that, you know, where are plum job assignments going? How are, and this is really when you get into the weeds of what's going on organizationally in decision making or how promotions are made. Another thing that certainly is a hot topic in today's day and age is around pay equity. And a lot of your most progressive companies do pay equity audits now. I know Salesforce, led by Mark Benioff, who's a very outspoken CEO champion of diversity and inclusion, they voluntarily do pay equity because we know another thing that the research shows is time and time, women are paid less for the same job that a man does. So the most progressive companies will do voluntary pay equity audits. So again, sponsorship, mentorship programs, pay equity audits. A lot of companies are really leveraging, and we saw some of this in the presentation, really leveraging their employee resource groups for business outcomes and for really being feeder pools for talent in an organization. So just a few, to answer your question, Drew, just a few of the things that great companies are doing. And, you know, I continue to be, this word never gets old because I continue to be pleasantly surprised by the really, and it's really innovation in the diversity space, right? And getting past the notion of thinking of diversity just as, I mean, just you know, here's an example of the ways you can run a meeting that's better engages both extroverts and introverts. So sending out an agenda ahead of time helps introverts feel more, because extroverts feel very comfortable voicing an opinion when you ask them for an opinion, but introverts may not feel that way. So if they have an agenda ahead of time, again, just very small things you can do to create meetings that are more inclusive for different personality types, different people. But inclusion by default does not happen. It has to be intentional. It has to be strategic. And the companies that are doing this and that are being thoughtful and putting resources behind figuring out how they can be more inclusive, both organizations as well as leaders, are really the ones that are going to outperform, especially in today's day and age.
Great. Well, that's going to conclude our time for today. Liji, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom on the importance of diversity and inclusion, and thank you to all of you for participating. Be looking for an email later this week with a link to the recording of today's presentation and also a request for feedback. We are always looking to improve upon our offerings to alumni, so please let us know how we can best support you. Thank you again for joining us.
Thanks so much, Drew. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.